Zoom in public session, and the purpose of this morning's engagement is to discuss the extremely important and pressing subject of rights and equality in the context of Brexit. I would like to extend a very warm welcome from Queen's University Belfast, Professor Colm Harvey. You're very welcome here before the committee today. From the Committee on the Administration of Justice, we are joined by Brian Gormley, the Director. You're very welcome, Brian. From the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, we are joined by Les Allenby, the Chief Commissioner, and Colin Coffey, Director, and you're both very welcome here this morning. And from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, we are joined by Emily Logan, the Chief Commissioner. Thank you very much, Emily, and Dr. Ruth Gallagher, Senior Advisor. And you're very welcome here also this morning. So I will shortly invite you all to make your opening statements, and in the order in which I've announced, if that's okay. But first, I'm obliged to draw to your attention the situation in relation to privilege. Please note that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name, or in such a way as to make him, her, or it identifiable. And members of the committee, once again, just to remind you that you should be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So without any further ado, we'll go straight into our business, and I'd like to invite Professor Harvey to deliver his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the invitation to appear in front of you today. My name is Professor Colm Harvey. I'm Professor of Human Rights Law in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast. I also mentioned that I've led an ESRC-funded project called Brexit Law and I, looking at the consequences of Brexit for Northern Ireland in the areas human rights, equality, conflict transformation and constitutional law and practice as well. What I'm going to do today is speak to three themes. I'm going to think about context, Brexit rights and equality, and I'm going to think about strengthening the protection of human rights. First, in terms of context, I want to be very clear. In relation to the North at the minute, there is a rights and equality deficit. I would put it as strongly as there's a crisis in the North at the moment in relation to rights and equality. And I want to make clear that Brexit is one part of that, but it's not the only part of that. In saying that, I want to acknowledge that there have been advances since 1998. I want to make that clear. There is a Human Rights Act, there's a Human Rights Commission, Equality Commission, Section 75 Equality Duty. There have been important advances since 1998 in the protection and promotion of human rights. But I'd like to make absolutely clear at the start, in terms of context, that the context in the north of this island right now is profoundly troubling, and there is an ongoing crisis in relation to human rights and equality. Second, I want to say something about Brexit rights and equality. We know that the UK is leaving the European Union. EU law is one part of a complex arrangement of rights and equality protections in the North that have fundamental significance and importance in supporting and underpinning the peace process in areas such as human rights, equality and socio-economic guarantees, and in areas such as employment law. The picture is complex, but there is no doubt that Brexit will have a serious impact in relation to rights and equality. We must acknowledge that rights and equality have made their way onto the agenda in terms of the Brexit negotiations. And I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge both the people in this room and beyond this room, who made absolutely sure that rights and equality featured in that conversation, because I think there was a real risk at the start of all this that rights and equality would be airbrushed out, that this would be a rather narrow conversation. That hasn't turned out to be the case. That's not an accident. The reason for that is because of extensive mobilisation around rights and equality by people in this room and beyond this room. We can see that in the recognition in the joint report from December 2017. We can see that in the withdrawal agreement. We can see that in the protocol. We can see that in the political declaration. As you know, the protocol and the withdrawal agreement contains an intriguing formula in relation to the protection of human rights. Protections in relation, no diminution in terms of Good Friday Agreement, rights in relation to the rights, safeguards and equality opportunity section. We know that it lists relevant provisions of European Union law. We know that the protocol refers to dedicated mechanisms in relation to enforcing that no diminution obligation. And we know, and we'll hear more today, there are ongoing conversations around those dedicated mechanisms and what they will be and how effective they will be. We know that it recognises the common travel area and the ongoing operation of the common travel area. We know that in the context of the level playing field discussions, we've seen important references in the protocol to socio-economic protections as well. There are important mechanisms in place in relation to the withdrawal agreement and protocol on enforcement and implementation, which are detailed, complicated, and we can talk more about today. But we know, for example, that the Commissioners will have a role in relation to the Specialised Committee in Northern Ireland, one mechanism under that agreement. If enforced and if the protocol is operationalised, it's clear, I think, that rights will inform many elements of the process going forward. But as you all know in this room today, that's a very big if. And equally important will be, even if the withdrawal agreement goes through, is secured in Parliament, getting that implemented in practice in legislation in Parliament will be an interesting and challenging task. What's worth noting, I think, I may be wrong on this, but these rights elements of the protocol and the withdrawal agreement seem not to be the principal source of contention at the moment. And there will be the real task ahead will be maximising the potential that the rights that have made their way there in the withdrawal agreement in the time ahead. We know that rights have been carried also into the future relations, political declaration, and we know that these need to be the discussions around rights and equality at this phase of the process need to be carried forward there. I think, as many people have stated, it is disappointing at this stage that rights in relation to Irish citizens in the North, questions about the identity provisions of the Good Friday Agreement have not featured more prominently than they have in these legal arrangements. Now, both governments could address this, but I think it's fair to say why more could not have been said about that at this particular stage, and we can discuss further today. Third, in terms of strengthening the protection of human rights on the island, as a matter of principle, it's important that human rights frames the conversation on the island going forward. Why? Because it's important that that conversation focuses on the people of the island of Ireland, all the people of the island of Ireland, and everyone. In terms of rights reform, look, it's clear solutions in relation to the human rights and equality deficit at the moment are there. There are proposals on the table. The problem is not the lack of solutions. There are credible legal proposals there. For example, in Northern Ireland, in the North, in relation to a Bill of Rights, equal marriage, language rights, women's rights, there are proposals there. There are credible legal ways forward. It's important going forward that the statutory bodies on the island of Ireland in relation to human rights and equality are fully resourced and supported to do their work. And it's important to note the recognition that these bodies have received through the withdrawal agreement and the recognition that human rights is received through the political declaration. Equally important has been the work of civil society on the island of Ireland. And in terms of protecting the human rights culture north and south going forward, it's important that civil society is also supported and resourced effectively to do its work. It's no good talking about civil society and its role in mobilisation of rights and equality if it is not adequately resourced and supported to do so. And I think there's a crisis in that area at the moment right now. It's important going forward that the Joint Committee on Human Rights in the island of Ireland is given a much more central role. Its role could be widened and deepened, and its work could be further expanded. How could it include the voices of civil society? How could it speak to many of the questions that we will be addressing in the day ahead? I think the Joint Committee on the Island of Ireland is going to have a fundamental role in the time ahead, not least in protecting the notion of equivalence, which is there in the Good Friday Agreement, and which needs to be revisited by another solution to some of the questions that we're talking about today, the neglected Charter of Rights on the island of Ireland. There's proposals on a Bill of Rights for the North from 2008. There's advice from the Joint Committee, a Charter of Rights from the island of Ireland in 2011. Both those things need to be urgently revisited in the context of the conversation that we're having now, in addition to the conversations we're having around the withdrawal agreement and the protocol and its implementation. In relation to strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights, there's a conversation ongoing now. I realise that conversation is not necessarily regarded as helpful by everyone on the island of Ireland, but there's a conversation now happening about the constitutional status of the North. I think that's quite a reasonable conversation to be having, given in the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. But it's equally important in that discussion that discussion includes a human rights and equality framework in terms of the sort of Ireland people are talking about when they're having the discussion around constitutional status. And let's be in no doubt at the moment whether that is regarded as helpful or unhelpful. That discussion has started. So better be prepared, better to plan, and better to frame that conversation around the rights and equality protections of everyone on the island. Just to conclude, in the North, there's a crisis right now in relation to rights and equality. There's a deficit in relation to rights and equality. We're not starting from a blank page. There are credible solutions there, legally credible solutions there, and proposals to address that crisis. The question that I have coming out of all that, and in the relation to the current discussions around Brexit, is there a willingness politically, because that's, I think, where we're at, is there a willingness politically to confront and address the human rights and equality crisis in the North? Because be in no doubt that legally credible solutions exist to solving that current crisis. Thank you very much, Chair and committee members.
Thank you, Professor Harvey, and also for your written submission in advance, and to all the colleagues for same, which is very helpful to committee members. I would now like to invite Mr. Gormley, on behalf of the Committee on the Administration of Justice, to deliver his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'd like to thank the Chair and members of this joint committee for the invitation to give evidence today. As you know, the Committee on the Administration of Justice, CAJ, is a Belfast-based independent human rights organisation which founds its analysis on international standards and takes no position on the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. There's no doubt that Brexit would damage and reduce protections for human rights and equality in a range of different ways. However, today I want to concentrate on the damage that may be done, and to an extent already has been done, to the peace agreement, which has brought 20 years of relative peace and stability to our island. Since conflict means a bonfire of rights, defending the peace is the first priority for human rights activists. At the moment, we still don't know if Brexit will actually happen, or if it does, in what particular way. However, the events of the past 2.5 years have already damaged the peace settlement and relations across this island. We presently have no devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, and the two major political parties are on opposite sides of an increasingly fractious debate. In our view, whatever happens, we need to rebuild our intertwined societies on the basis of a new dispensation based on human rights and equality. In the coming years, there will be further dislocation and disagreement, whatever happens with Brexit, as the constitutional status of Northern Ireland again comes to the fore with a probable border poll. We need a resilient society and politics with institutions across the island which people can trust to be fair and transparent. In the attached briefing, we make some proposals that come out of our enhanced understanding of the weaknesses and pressure points that the Brexit debate process has laid bare. The citizenship issue is an example of how basic assumptions of the Good Friday Agreement have been undermined. It recognises the birthright of the people of Northern Ireland to hold Irish or British citizenship on the basis of equality. The basic breach of this principle of equality by Brexit would be that Irish citizens would remain EU citizens, whereas British citizens wouldn't. It amounts to a new focus of divisions between the two main communities here. But it's also become clear that Brexit could make the status of Irish citizens born in Northern Ireland constitutionally and practically insecure. If Brexit goes ahead, Irish citizens will be EU citizens living in a non-member state. But what rights do they have to live, work, access health and social services and fully participate in social and political life in that state where they were born? There are several possible answers to that. The first possibility is that the Home Office will regard Irish citizens as really British, since UK nationality law decrees that most of those born in the UK have British citizenship. The second possibility is that the Common Travel Area will sort all this out. In fact, as the Human Rights Commission has suggested, Common Travel Area rights are in fact built on sand. The third possibility is that under the withdrawal agreement, EU citizens living in the UK can retain many of their current rights by applying for settled status. You must make an application to the Home Office before the transition period ends. However, Theresa May magnanimously withdrew the £65 charge on Monday afternoon. None of these options is appealing, as they all involve the implication that those who choose Irish identity are in some ways second-class citizens. Their rights as full participants in Northern Ireland life would depend on either a denial of their Irish nationality, as yet unknown bilateral agreements between the UK and Ireland about the CTA, or asking the Home Office to graciously allow them leave to live in the land of their birth. The reality is that Irish citizens born and living in Northern Ireland have no legal connection to the jurisdiction in which they were born. Legislation is needed both in the UK and Ireland to recognise the particular status of Irish citizens born in Northern Ireland and their unequivocal right to participate fully in that region and as fully as feasible in Irish society, and full equality in the rights British and Irish citizens can access. A treaty enshrining these provisions in international law would repair the damage, or some of it, done to the principle of the agreement. The other measures to protect rights in this coming situation of political turmoil we propose are the following. To prevent a racist immigration policy and the territory of Northern Ireland becoming one big border, we propose that the Irish government reject any practice of racial profiling and begin an open and transparent debate about how immigration into the Common Travel Area is managed. The Charter of Rights for the Island of Ireland, which has already been mentioned, signed by political parties, should be revisited. Commitments to human rights and equality-based decision-making, with all the principles of transparency and public involvement that would involve, could be the basis of an island-wide code of political behaviour. Equivalence in the protection of rights north and south is a basic principle of the agreement. It's important that some way of guaranteeing that rights are and will in perpetuity be protected in an equivalent manner in both jurisdictions is developed, whether in compatible legislation or treaty. Abuses of power, sectarian decision-making and a corrosive lack of trust between the two major parties in the north led to the downfall of the devolved institutions. We need an equality and human rights-based return to devolution based on the full implementation of the rights provisions of the peace settlement, particularly the Bill of Rights, but also addressing international rights obligations and working fully within the existing rules. Brexit threatens human rights and equality protections in a number of specific ways. However, its main impact has already been to destabilise both the provisions of the peace settlement and the relations between the two jurisdictions on this island. The current uncertainty and political turmoil may subside to an extent, especially if Brexit doesn't actually go ahead. But trust and confidence have already been undermined. Questions of identity and citizenship have been opened up in a way not seen since well before the agreement. Those genies cannot be put back in the bottle. We therefore need a set of measures across the island and, where possible, on the basis of formal treaties between the two sovereign states involved, which can stabilise trust and build resilience as we move into a future of change and challenge. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gormley, and again also for your very useful associate document circulated previously to members. I would now like to invite the Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, Les Allenby, to deliver the opening statement on behalf of his organisation.
Thank you, Chair and Committee, for the invitation. Can I, and I'm in your hands, Chair, and those of your colleagues, in keeping with the Joint Committee, Emily and I have a kind of joint presentation where the Irish Commission were going to set out the context, the aims that we'd set ourselves as a joint committee and the work that we've done to date. I was going to then provide some analysis of the withdrawal agreement and what we think we've achieved and what needs to be done. It might aid coherence to go the other way. I'm happy to go now, but so it's...
If you have already worked out a formula that works for you both.
Just for ease of reference for
That's
for
what we're all about,
okay,
bringing you together.
Great. Good morning.
It's the subtext.
Thank you,
Emily,
Chair.
you have the floor.
Thanks,
Thank
Chair.
you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Les. And thanks to the committee for the invitation to discuss the issues and potential risks raised by Brexit in terms of human rights and equality protection across the island. I'm very pleased to be here today with our colleagues from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, addressing the committee in our capacity as the joint committee established in the Good Friday Agreement of both commissions on this occasion. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement has legal status within international law as a peace treaty lodged with the United Nations. The agreement laid down not only a mandate for both national human rights institutions, but also the mechanism to ensure strong cooperation between them by way of the joint committee, with representatives of the two bodies, North and South, as a forum for consideration of human rights issues on the island of Ireland. As you'll see today, there's strong trust and strong shared of sense purpose across both commissions. And today's an important opportunity to recall those commitments made back in 1998, which were grounded, as has been said before, in the human rights and equality provisions of the 1998 agreement. However, as you know, the human rights and equality framework contained in the agreement assumed that the UK and Ireland would continue to be members of the European Union. Although the joint report of December 2017 committed to protecting the agreement in all its parts, Brexit negotiations currently depart from that common framework, creating risks for both rights and remedies. While we as a joint committee have worked collaboratively for many years, I'm going to limit my remarks this morning to outlining the joint committee's work relevant to today's discussion. As a joint committee, we're pleased to see the UK's commitment to no diminution of rights as to protect the Good Friday Agreement in the joint report outlined in December 2017. In March 2018, the joint committee published its policy statement on the matter and made 6 key recommendations, which I just want to run through today, that ought to be adhered to in the UK-EU negotiations on the withdrawal agreement that followed. The first is that we strongly recommended the retention of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights in UK law, as well as a clear and enforceable commitment to no diminution of human rights and equality standards following the withdrawal. The UK Government committed in December 2017 to ensuring that no diminution of rights is caused by departure from the European Union. The draft withdrawal agreement, published in November 2018, then narrowed this commitment to the rights included in the Rights, Safeguards and Equality of Opportunity section of the Good Friday Agreement, insofar as those rights or standards are protected by EU membership. We called for the withdrawal agreement to provide for continuing North-South equivalence of rights. We believe that the offer of continued EU citizenship or equivalent rights should be extended to all the people of Northern Ireland, as defined by the Good Friday Agreement, given recognition of the birthright of all the people of Northern Ireland to identify themselves and be accepted as Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. The very last situation we would like to see is one where the people of Northern Ireland feel forced to choose an identity based on what they think their post-Brexit entitlements might be. We believe that any increase in border controls would impact negatively on the exercise of rights. People on both sides of the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland regularly cross the border, as was well known to this committee, to exercise their right to work, to access public services, including health, education, to visit family, for example. And the protection of border communities and migrant workers remains paramount when we consider issues that go beyond the common travel area arrangements in terms of protecting rights. The fifth recommendation is about evolving justice arrangements, ensuring that those arrangements comply with commitment to non-diminution of rights, which continues to be a concern for the Joint Committee. These include the operation of the European Arrest Warrant, how prisoners are repatriated and transferred between Member States, how policing cooperation takes place when the UK is no longer a member of Europol, how information and data is shared for criminal purposes, and how cross-border justice arrangements will take place on the island of Ireland. The protection of human rights is closely linked to ensuring accountability for human rights violations, and cooperation in criminal justice investigations are therefore critical. The final recommendation by the Joint Committee is the right to participation in public life, another aspect of the North-South equivalence of rights under the 1998 agreement. And it's important to consider how those in Northern Ireland to whom EU citizenship is to be offered exceptionally after Brexit will continue to be represented in EU democratic institutions. Repeating and reiterating Colin Harvey's point about recognising the contribution of people both here today and beyond who have ensured that human rights and equality has been given the attention it so deserves. For the purpose of this meeting, I want to chronicle the efforts of the Joint Committee, North and South, in terms of particularly over the last year, throughout 2018. As a Joint Committee, it started by meeting with Taoiseach Simon Coveney TD and with Brexit coordination team in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We met with ambassadors and key officials in the UK and Irish permanent missions, both in the UN in Geneva and EU in Brussels. We met with the Article 50 Task Force on 3 occasions in 2018, including with Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier, Deputy Chief Negotiator Sabine Weyand and Northern Ireland Advisor Nina Obermeyer. We travelled to Westminster to meet with Robin Walker MP, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department for Exiting the European Union, and his officials. We also met with Lord Duncan, Under-Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, in Stormont House a number of times. In each of these meetings, and in particular with the task force, we made clear that as a joint committee with a mandate in statute, we wish to have as formal a role as possible in the post-Brexit monitoring human rights and equality on the island of Ireland. In November 2018, we launched research commissioned by the Joint Committee and carried out by academics in Newcastle, Durham and Birmingham universities, and the research recommended that both the Irish and UK governments should look to secure what they described as a gold standard approach through a new intergovernmental common travel arrangement that they saw should be provided through a treaty. Such a treaty would formalise common immigration rules, travel rights, residency rights and related rights to education, social security, work, health, security and justice. Of particular concern in our work at this crucial period of the negotiations, and possibly also of concern to this committee, are the issues of North-South equivalence of rights on an ongoing basis and the guarantee of equality of citizenship. Thank you, Chair, and my thanks to the committee for giving us an opportunity to meet this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Logan. Mr. Allenby, would you like to, or were you happy to leave it for the questioning part?
I'm happy to present now and then
yes, well,
question
please.
them, if that's okay.
Please, if you would. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Chair and Committee, for the invitation. I want to start by just endorsing Emily's remarks about the level of engagement we've had with the British and Irish Government and the Commission's Task Force 50, and also to pay tribute to the work of human rights NGOs, that both those who are here and others in civic society who've played a very active role in the campaign and debate around the ramifications of leaving the EU for human rights and equality. The 6 recommendations of the Joint Committee that were outlined by Emily really had twin aims. First, to preserve the existing human rights protections that we have, and alongside that, to at least keep pace with human rights and equality developments as they progress within the EU in the future. So we recognise both preservation and development as key aspects of this. Our view is that the withdrawal agreement, the draft, does suggest that substantial progress has been made within the document, but there are also some significant gaps. And I suppose what I want to do quickly is start with the good news and then say something about where we think the work that still needs to be done. I think the Northern Ireland Protocol contains a number of quite important provisions, and they shouldn't be underestimated. First is the UK government's commitment to ensuring no diminution of the rights contained within the Rights, Safeguards and Equality of Opportunity section of the 1998 agreement as a result of leaving the EU. And I emphasise it's one part of the agreement, not the whole agreement. I think we would have liked to have seen the whole of the agreement in there, but that's by the by. Second, that a number of specific EU directives will continue to have effect in Northern Ireland, covering equal treatment, for example, in accessing goods and services, in employment, self-employment and social security, alongside equal treatment between persons of racial or ethnic origin, and that extends to other groups beyond that. And those commitments cover both existing protection and keeping pace with future EU protections as they develop. And that gives Northern Ireland some additional protections over and above the rest of the UK. Third, and very important, the UK and Irish government will continue to be able to make arrangements for the common travel area, including offering more favourable treatment than to other EU citizens in certain circumstances. Fourth, that existing North-South cooperation will be maintained in a number of areas, including justice and security, particularly important, and that both governments may continue to build on the provision of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in other areas of North-South cooperation, while still respecting EU law. And fifth, institutional arrangements are put in place to oversee the protocol, and in turn, those arrangements can fit into the full oversight architecture within the withdrawal agreement, and Colin Harvey mentioned the importance of that. However, there are a number of outstanding issues still to be resolved. The first of those is to determine the actual scope and extent of the protections provided by the non-diminution commitment within the rights safeguards section of the 1998 agreement. It's fair to say that that section was not drafted with the EU law in mind. The assumption was that we would be remaining within the EU. So it contains a number of specific commitments to rights, but it also embraces much broader aims. So, for example, social inclusion, the advancement of women in public life, respect, understanding and tolerance in relation to linguistic diversity, victims' rights to remember and contribute to a changed society. How those concepts, broad concepts, will be translated and interpreted with reference to EU law, frankly, remains to be seen. We would take an expansive view of that. Whether the courts would take the same view is a matter of conjecture. We've argued strongly that explicit reference should be made as a minimum to a number of other EU directives. So, for example, on parental leave, on rights of pregnant workers, the rights of victims being covered should all be covered by the non-diminution commitment. And that's something that remains to be confirmed, but we ourselves in the Equality Commission have made very strong representations and the Joint Committee on that. Second, there's the UK government's decision to no longer be bound by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Charter largely mirrors the rights contained in the European Convention on Human Rights, but it goes further and includes a number of economic and social rights. The 1998 agreement, as Brian outlined earlier, envisaged a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, supplementing the rights contained in the Convention to reflect the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland, drawing on international instruments and experience. In effect, a Bill of Rights was to provide a Convention Plus approach to human rights protection. And although the Charter postdates the 1998 agreement and only applies it in conjunction with EU law, the Charter remains the closest equivalent we have to a Convention Plus approach contemplated in a Bill of Rights. It's been argued that while the draft withdrawal agreement does not incorporate the Charter into Northern Ireland law, other provisions within the withdrawal agreement mean the Charter would apply extensively. Moreover, the UK government have argued that much of the Charter will be retained in either common law or statute law. Nonetheless, for us, the loss of the EU Charter in its current form would lead to a loss, first of all, of legal certainty and consistency, as you would now have to argue effectively that the Charter applies as well as how it applies. In addition, the Charter is an accessible document, and the wider understanding of rights would be hampered through the failure to incorporate it within the draft withdrawal agreement. The retention of the Charter would also provide a degree of continuing equivalence of rights across the island of Ireland, and it's therefore in line with the spirit of the 1998 agreement. So for all of those reasons, the Commission continues to hold that the Charter should be retained for Northern Ireland, at least until a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland is introduced. Third, while confirmation that the Common Travel Area will continue is welcome, leaving the EU changes the legal dynamic that underpins the existing and future arrangements, particularly around freedom of movement. The formal legal underpinnings are relatively scant, as has been outlined in the work that the Joint Committee commissioned, and it relies on provisions of EU law, both freedom of movement and other associated rights. Now, to safeguard against any future dilution of Common Travel Area arrangements, and I recognise that there is no desire on either the UK or the Irish government to dilute them at this point, but frankly, for future-proofing, we recommend that the two governments should agree a common travel area treaty covering immigration rules, travel rights, residency rights, and related rights to education, social security, work, health, and security and justice. And moreover, we have to recognise that access to some rights in a cross-border setting remain determined by EU law rather than the Common Travel Area. And childcare within UK social security benefits is one example. So the Common Travel Area is not the answer to all the ills of rights in cross-border workers. Fourth is the extent of the commitment made in the December 2017 report that the people who are Irish citizens will continue to enjoy rights as EU citizens. And what that means in practice remains unclear. So focusing solely on those who identify as Irish within Northern Ireland creates a potential towards unequal citizenship counter to the principles of the 1998 agreement, unless those rights are extended to all the people of Northern Ireland, whether they identify themselves as British, British and Irish, or Irish. And the Commission's assessment is, on the basis of what we've seen since the December 2017 report, is that the ambition of those initial intentions from within the EU 27 have been significantly tempered, and we'd like to see clarity as to what exactly the rights and entitlements will be for Irish citizens in Northern Ireland when the UK leaves the European Union. Fifth, briefly, long-term arrangements on the issues of justice, security and data sharing arrangements, very important, have yet to be agreed, and that includes the continuation of the European arrest warrant and the question of how oversight and redress is maintained, given the UK government's red line that it wishes to leave the Court of Justice of the European Union, and we still don't know in detail what the bespoke alternative is and it's the fine detail that always counts in these issues. And then sixth is the issue of EU law has provided significant rights protections for people living in Northern Ireland, and the withdrawal agreement cements some of those protections, but by no means all of them. And it seems to us that there is a real likelihood of Northern Ireland diverging from Ireland and other EU member states in EU-led rights protections. And we've seen how Northern Ireland has fallen behind other parts of the UK in terms of Single Equality Act, for example, in terms of equal marriage, in terms of rights to abortion, etc. Those are all issues that we could see in the future, Northern Ireland being a backmarker rather than the leader in development of rights, without the important value of EU law to provide some underpinning protection. And then finally is the value of the dedicated mechanism, alluded to by Colin. It will be determined, and its effectiveness will be determined by the statutory powers and the mandate given to the two commissions and the Joint Committee, and the resources provided to the commissions. And alongside that, we've also argued very strongly that there must be individual rights of enforcement with access to legal aid for those on low incomes. And separate individual rights of enforcement have not been confirmed in the protocol, though we anticipate that that will happen. We don't think that the Commission should be the only place where people should be able to enforce their rights. People should have the choice to do that of their own volition, as well as through the Commissions. So, in summary, there remains a great deal to be done, assuming the withdrawal agreement eventually comes into effect, and we are committed to continuing to battle for those issues that we've identified. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Allenby, and to both Emily and yourself for your joint approach. Just before I bring in members, I think it is important to state that this committee unanimously agreed to address this whole matter. And it is a recognition on all our part, and the diverse politics that we represent, that this is the most important issue that we all currently face on this island, and arguably in our lifetime, and certainly in the lifetime of our children. It can have a seismic impact on all our lives and in every aspect of life, including in the areas of rights and equality. And as the Committee on Justice and Equality, we felt that it was our responsibility to accommodate this address this morning. And I want to again thank each of you for your respective contributions, both orally and in writing to the Committee in advance of today's hearing. I have a number of indications. The first of those is Senator Niall O'Donnell, followed by Deputy Jim O'Callaghan, and I'll take people as they indicate. That's the list so far. The floor is yours, Senator O'Donnell.
Caoimhghín Ó thank you, Chair, and thanks to all of our visitors this morning. There's a fair bit to get through there in terms of your contributions, and there remains much more outside of it. So I have a couple of points just that I want to, and questions that I want to hone in on, Chair, with your indulgence. On Les's fourth point there, which I accept around the issue of citizenship rights post-Brexit, and you know the rights that continue to be enjoyed or won't be enjoyed, he's right. But I would add on to that a failure to recognise or implement or legislate for Irish citizens in the North sustains an inequality in itself. So I do accept the point that we need to include and recognise all of the citizens in the North, but we also need to be careful that we don't leave a significant chunk of the population behind by not legislating for their rights in the current context. The second point, Chair, is on Brian's presentation, and it touches on some of Colin's, Professor Harvey's points around the basic assumptions of the Good Friday Agreement being undermined by Brexit. He's absolutely right. I have been saying for way back at the very start of this, the EU's Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee said that Brexit would require an alteration of the Good Friday Agreement, and they said that right from the get-go. But it also shows and flags up the point that so many aspects of the Good Friday Agreement actually remain unimplemented in terms of our rights. So it comes down to, and you made the number of points about the constitutionally and practically insecure nature of our rights as Irish citizens who are resident in the North. And for me, the points around the British Home Office in particular are pertinent and they're live because of the D'Souza case, and I don't want to venture too deep into that because it is there is an ongoing appeal in relation to it. But I suppose your point around the possibility of the Home Office regarding citizens as really British. It isn't a presumption, it's happening. And the D'Souza case shows us that it's happening. So the presumption is that people like the D'Souzas, people like me, everyone in the North, is automatically presumed to be British citizens. And that is the legislation that applies to them. So for me, who is nowhere near as eminent as yourselves in terms of these issues, that is in direct contradiction to the citizenship aspect of the Good Friday Agreement. So my question in relation to that is, how does the Irish government, you've made the point about both governments legislating, I don't sense an appetite within the British system to legislate for our rights, given what they're inflicting on us at the moment. But how does the Irish government legislate or bring proposals forward that protects and upholds our rights as citizens? I've been asking them for a long time what our rights as Irish citizens are beyond the holding of a passport, and they haven't been able to tell me. So you might be able to expand on some ideas around that. The third point is the issue of democratic representation and voting rights to continue to elect representatives to the EU institutions, obviously the Parliament. My understanding is that it was my colleague Martina Anderson who sought legal advice that the Irish government could have provided the additional 2 seats allocated to Ireland for people who are resident in the North. They decided not to. Is it too late? Can they still? Are there other avenues? Are there other examples where people may have the opportunity to elect 2 elected for outside of the jurisdiction? And finally, just really to ask all of them, well, probably Liz, primarily around the issue of the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages. Obviously, the British government are signed up to the Charter. It is probably as limited and as marginal as it is the only protection for Indigenous and minority languages in the North. Has there been any research or any scoping done, given the political dynamic around language issues and the demand for proper legislation? That's really the only thing that we have, and are we in danger of losing that, and what threat does it pose? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator, and I hope you've all had your pens operating there, because there's a compendium of questions, and I'm going to maybe start with Colm. But before I do, just to flag up at this point in time, the importance of this meeting, I believe, cannot be overstated. And I'd just like to indicate to colleague members and to our guests that we've arranged with the communications unit, who I commented on earlier, we'd have a group photograph at the end of our meeting. If you're happy to join us, and colleagues, if you were planning to escape off to other climes in this institution, you might like to stay to the end.
Trying to drive us away.
Professor Harvey, would you like to lead off in terms of responses to Senator O'Donnell's observations and questions, please?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think in terms of context, I am disappointed that some of the complex issues arising from the situation and the agreement, although it's been much talked about, we're yet to see evidence that all the consequences have been fully worked through concretely and legally at this stage. And that's why I think I was disappointed to see that paragraph 52 of the joint report from December 2017, that we haven't seen more progress in relation to the unique circumstances of the Northern Ireland in relation to this conversation, because these are precisely the sorts of questions that we need clarity on. I think on the birthright issue, there's 2 things. I think, first of all, it's not well understood in Britain. It's not well understood on this island, right? So some of the things that we're talking about today will require work by the British government, but a number of the things we're talking about today will require work by the Irish government to make some of these things legally meaningful as well. So I think there's an issue around the birthright provisions of the agreement not being well understood. And remember, we're talking about an international treaty that is there and brings with it obligations. But there's also the question, which I'm afraid many of us around this table are tired really of saying, the Good Friday Agreement has not been effectively implemented in domestic law in a UK context, in this and in other areas. There's been a failure of effective and comprehensive implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and in my view, this is one example of it. So there is an issue of misunderstanding, but there's also an issue of follow-through and changing domestic law to reflect the complexities of this provision, or else people are going to find themselves in a bureaucratic mess. I have to say that also relates to the European Union as well, in its negotiations over this, of providing necessary assurances around this too in the context of the current conversation. I would say that the Bill of Rights proposals from the Human Rights Commission from 2008 need to be dusted off, because there was an attempt in those proposals to try and grapple with some of this, to try and formalise aspects of the agreement that have been neglected. But so there's an issue, in another work I've been doing with Anne Smith at Ulster University on the Bill of Rights, who talked about a formalisation gap. So given that people are so keen on the Good Friday Agreement today, we just need to see some of it more effectively implemented. That's also true of the conversation we've heard in relation to the common travel area. We've heard a lot of talk of the common travel area, but what has emerged as a matter of absolute urgency, actually in both jurisdictions, Britain and on this island, is the need to formalise, codify the common travel area. Because at the moment, Les, you've talked about being written in sand, and I think there's an emerging consensus that there needs to be a bilateral treaty. And I would say a bilateral treaty that's a comprehensive bilateral treaty, making these common travel area rights actually meaningful in practice. So there's a formalisation gap there. Look, and in relation to that too, there are issues with the Irish government. Ireland needs to be sure that its domestic law policy and practice actually respects the common travel area as well. I think we need to have that conversation too on this island. So there's things that could be done. On voting rights in the European Parliament, this is the bit I think that frustrates me. Because all along the Brexit negotiations, people have used the language of imagination, creativity and flexibility. But some of it has not been evident in the discussions around, for example, voting rights, where there's a view that this is doable and possible. Yeah. If there's political will in this jurisdiction to do this, that this can be done. So this is an area where a bit of imagination and creativity by the Irish government in relation to voting rights, in relation to the North, should be exercised. And it's very disappointing to hear people talk about this as being unrealistic and not possible, when it seems fairly clear that aspects of this are legally doable. And some of that would also address some of the problems and discussions that are emerging around the protocol. One of the criticisms that you're hearing around the protocol and the backstop is around the democratic deficit. Maybe one way to deal with an aspect of that is around the extension of voting rights in relation to the North, and handling the complexities of that, whether that's on this island, but in the context of those EU-UK negotiations. So I think there's a big issue for me that Brexit is highlighting a formalisation and codification gap in relation to the Good Friday Agreement, in relation to the common travel area. There's things that the Irish government could be doing to follow through on this, and it's important that they do their bit as well in the context of this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Gormley, would you like to, and if colleagues, Les, Colin, Emily and Ruth, just as you would indicate if something is particular to the Senator's contribution that you'd like to come back on, it's open to you all. But Brian, I just invite you to, please.
Thanks. Well, there is a lot to get through here, so I'll try to be very brief. I think we've got to look at the Good Friday Agreement and what it was meant to do when we're looking at the citizenship issue. Human rights organisations, generally speaking, don't get into citizenship all that much, because human rights are human rights, irrespective of citizenship. But in this particular aspect, the Good Friday Agreement was about creating a geographical and political space that could be shared by people with different national identities and allegiances. That was one of the fundamental principles, at least, under the agreement. Now, as part of that, then the full equality between people's choice of citizenship, it has to be maintained. And what we said right at the beginning was that the British government unilaterally deprives British citizens born in the north of their right to be our EU citizens. Now, we suggested, well, treat everybody born in the north as EU citizens on the basis of a reciprocal arrangement that would allow free movement into the north and would make this island a unit from that point of view. That's not been taken up. When you look at what are the actual rights of Irish citizens as EU citizens, well, as Les said, it's still not clear. But in our... Sorry.
Right. I suppose at the heart of that's the pertinent question, but also is, what are Irish citizens' rights as Irish citizens? Well, because before the EU can legislate for us, the Irish government needs to legislate for us. I can apply for a passport and travel around the world. I can move freely at present around the island of Ireland. But beyond that, as the D'Souza case shows, the presumption is unilaterally by one party to the Good Friday Agreement is that despite what the Good Friday Agreement says, despite its legislative outcomes and its lodging at the UN and the EU and all the rest of it, the presumption is that universally across the board, all of us born 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement has been signed are British. And until such times as we then go to renounce a citizenship we have never held, we don't want, with the greatest respect, no harm, and that relates to everything you just said about competing nationalities and allegiances, there is a legislative requirement, and despite what the Home Office said, they're taking people through the courts. Yeah. They're defying the word in the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement by saying, actually, all that's well and good. So they're political, and the Irish government, and I understand it up to a point, remain silent on that. We're in the midst of a negotiation, and there might be a degree of sense in doing that. But there's no evidence for me that says, or indeed for the people who are having to go through this, that says, well, the Irish government are legislating for our rights in this circumstance. There's no evidence of it. It's not happening. So essentially, you are having imposed upon you a British citizenship, not just in that case, but also unless there is the legislative instruments required from this jurisdiction and from the EU that offsets and protects us against. So it comes back to Les's point. I'm not going to be a second class, I'm going to be a third or fourth citizen, a class citizen resident in the north because of what we're seeing transpire, and also because the Irish government, who adopted constitutionally the Good Friday Agreement and all of its parts, aren't legislating for our rights. So I appreciate that's more of a point, but it's just one I feel strongly about, and it's one that these institutions and society and rights and civic organisations here need to absorb and need to understand that Irish citizens in Donegal and Omagh and Strabane and Belfast aren't quasi-Irish citizens or, somehow they're Irish citizens whose rights are in jeopardy at present. So we need the kind of mobilisation we've seen from civic society in the north amongst civic and human rights organisations in this state that says that is unacceptable, and that the Irish government need to, within the context of Brexit and the commitments they've made, protect those people. So to Brona, Chair. Apologies.
Yes, Senator, and back to you, Brian.
Exactly. But the point is that Brexit has peeled away and shown the lack of proper legislative and constitutional underpinning of the Good Friday Agreement, as Colin has just been saying. So there is an Irish citizen doesn't, by virtue of their Irish citizenship, have the right to live and reside in Northern Ireland under UK law. Now, that's what needs to be changed. The UK needs to legislate. Very likely the Irish government also needs to legislate. And what we would argue is that should be given international legal effect by a treaty. And it's that kind of thing that is necessary to underpin the agreement. And it's this realisation which, it's taken this 2.5 years of debate for it to become clear, I think, that there is not the same legal underpinning of the rights of Irish citizens as there are of British citizens in terms of their rights within the territory of Northern Ireland. And it's that kind of thing. These may seem abstruse legal technicalities, but as I think as your impassioned points have demonstrated, this actually goes to the heart of identity. And it goes to the heart of what the Good Friday Agreement was going to do, was supposed to do, goes to the heart of where it's not been fully implemented and the danger that Brexit demonstrates towards it.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Liz, would you like to come in, please?
No, thanks. I'll succinctly try and deal with all 3 points that you've made. First of all, we recognise the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was very much about identity rights. It was also about parity of esteem. And what we've tried to do as a joint committee and in our discussions with the UK government has been sought to recognise that that entails recognising both the rights of those who are Irish within Northern Ireland and the rights of those who are British. And that has different dimensions. I think there are some answers. I think, as Colin suggested, it's one of the areas that was interrogated in some detail in the advice that was given by the Human Rights Commission in 2008. So in terms of solutions, a Bill of Rights is one of the places where some of these issues could be dealt with. I'm not sure it could be comprehensively argued with, but the common travel area and having some kind of international treaty or bilateral agreement is potentially where, although I'm not sure that you could, but you could certainly deal with some of the issues there. It's clear that we've got an immigration white paper within the UK, which, slightly simplistically but not far off the mark, will be treating EU citizens in the future as if they are in kind of broadly the same ways that non-EU citizens are currently treated. So the issue of freedom of movement and the rights of Irish citizens makes the common travel area and some of these other issues even more important. So I think there are some answers to some of those questions that could be found. I mean, I should comment on the Good Friday Agreement that the rights and what I call the participatory elements of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement are the unfinished business. It's not just a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, it's the All-Ireland Charter of Rights, which was mentioned by Brian. It's the Civic Forum or some equivalent. None of those have been put in place 20 years on, and that's a big gap in terms of the agreement. In terms of the representation rights, I think while there are some clearly EU elements to this, a great deal of this probably falls within the Irish government. There are other member states where citizens from outside of the country can vote in elections. So it's not as if that's not an issue that has been addressed in many other member states.
I mean, the big irony there is, and the obvious point is that they're telling us they're going to legislate for constitutional reform to give us presidential voting rights outside of the state. So surely you would imagine if they can legislate for that, they can then legislate for residents outside the state to elect to the European institutions, or perhaps that's just too simplistic, but it's certainly a point that jumps out at me right away.
Yeah, there are some issues about, it's clear that access, for example, to Irish citizens in Northern Ireland will still have access to EU institutions. That's one of the areas where the EU27 are on record about what Irish citizens will retain. But one of the interesting things for me is that access to those institutions are probably the only areas where they've been very clear about what rights will be retained by EU citizens. Beyond that, the freedom from discrimination, freedom to assert your kind of national rights have been said in very broad terms, but what they mean in practice is very unclear. My guess is that the Irish government is hoping for a EU27-wide UK negotiated solution. In other words, the UK government's on record as wanting, for example, all UK citizens to retain access to a European health insurance card, access to educational opportunities across the EU, an Erasmus programme, etc. And therefore, if that kind of agreement is reached, then the gap between Irish citizens in Northern Ireland and those who identify as British in Northern Ireland will be relatively small. If, on the other hand, there is no agreement on some of those core issues when you move outside of Northern Ireland to the rest of the EU, then the gap between the Irish and British citizens will be very different. And then you've got the internal issues that Brian has alluded to around Irish citizenship, d'Souza, etc. The third issue you mentioned, which is the European Charter of Regional and Minority Languages, the question of trying to get within the withdrawal agreement some reference to what will be covered in terms of language rights, given it's in the relevant section of the agreement. That's been a discussion between ourselves, the Equality Commission and the UK government. I'm not sure we've convinced them that it should be explicitly put into any kind of document that might follow the withdrawal agreement to flesh out the detail. But it remains in play that if the withdrawal agreement and if the protocol and if how you, as I said at the start of my submission, how you translate the rights contained in the Good Friday Agreement and some of the broad concepts into EU law will become a matter for, no doubt people will come to both commissions, people may come to lawyers. So I suspect that's an issue that will be in play if the withdrawal agreement is introduced. But what the outcome of that will be remains to be seen. But I'd be surprised to see it very explicitly put into any kind of document that says definitively, yes, it is contained. I don't think you could legitimately put in a document and say, no, it isn't. So I suspect it's going to be one of those areas to see how it's interpreted in practice.
Okay, Liz, would you like to come in? Emily, are we okay? We are happy?
They're more than...
Okay, all right. Senator, you're happy? You rest your case?
I don't know about that.
The Senator, by the way, is sometimes affectionately referred to as the Choctadola, the TD for the short strand. So, there you are. Deputy Jim O'Callaghan, please.
Thanks very much, Chairman. And thanks, everyone, for coming in. Very interesting to listen to you all in respect to this complicated issue. Obviously, at the time of the referendum, the Brexit referendum, very little attention was given to the impact it would have upon Ireland, in particular Northern Ireland. And similarly, notwithstanding your efforts, I think very little and insufficient attention has been given to the impact Brexit will have on the rights of individuals in Northern Ireland, irrespective of which citizenship they carry. I'm going to just start by asking some questions in terms of what Neil was asking you there, because I just need to probe it a bit more, and maybe my understanding isn't as advanced as Neil's. But at present in Northern Ireland, obviously everyone born there has European Union citizenship. They're citizens of the European Union. And some of them are Irish citizens, and some of them are British citizens, and some of them are both. And obviously, after Brexit, those people who are Irish citizens and who don't want to be British citizens in Northern Ireland, like, what is the legal basis upon which they will reside and work in Northern Ireland after Brexit? Is it that under the British Nationality Act that they're automatically deemed to be British?
Do you wish to direct to any who would like to take this up? Brian, please.
Well, yes, at the moment. That is the only legal basis as far as we can see. I mean, interestingly, the Home Office realised that at this moment in time, if an Irish citizen goes outside the CTA and then wishes to come back, there isn't any actual legal basis for that. And there is draft legislation now put in the House of Commons to remedy that particular aspect. But, you know, this is the fundamental underlying point, that the status of Irish citizenship vis-à-vis rights in the north is only at the moment effective by virtue of them being EU citizens. Once Brexit happens, the only legal basis underlying things is, as you correctly say, the British Nationality Act, which says that, with some exceptions, people born in the UK are to be regarded as British citizens.
And have you to do anything to invoke citizenship under the British Nationality Act, or is it automatically assumed you're British because you're born in the UK?
You don't have to do anything.
Okay.
It's automatically assumed. The Irish situation is more complicated. You've got to do something that only an Irish citizen could do, which is usually apply for a passport. But then that's kind of backdated to birth. And in any event, most Irish citizens in the north are Irish citizens by virtue of descent as well. But
of course, that act predated the agreement in 1998, and obviously the point being made is that the agreement of 1998 recognises the political entitlement of every person in Northern Ireland to, in effect, choose citizenship.
That's right.
So the point being made, presumably by Niall and others, is that after, when Brexit occurs, that they will have forced upon them a British citizenship that they don't wish to have for the purpose of affecting their rights to work and rights of residency and all basic rights.
That's right.
Okay,
It's also just, it's worth pointing out that that's being contested in court at the moment.
Yes,
and
the
first-tier tribunal, the judge found that in his consideration, the Good Friday Agreement superseded the British Nationality Act. So you have this whole live case around that at the minute, so that it is.
And Brian, your point is that maybe one of the options is that Irish citizens in Northern Ireland would have to apply for the settled status that has been identified by the British government. Is that a point you were making, or may have to?
Well, it's not a question that they necessarily would have to access rights, but it's certainly a way in which existing rights could be maintained.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I find it difficult to envisage that many people in the north would want to go down the route of asking the Home Office have they the right to remain in the land of their birth. But in principle, that's it. We don't know, of course, yet, and we've actually asked the Home Office or a junior Northern Ireland Office Minister whether or not the Home Office would accept such an application from somebody born in Northern Ireland. He said he didn't know and would get back to us in writing. So far we haven't had that, and that's a few weeks back before Christmas. So we don't know what line the Home Office would take. But the whole point about this is not, in a sense, to get into the complexities of nationality and citizenship law, but to demonstrate how Brexit has exposed, if you like, the lack of a proper legal underpinning to the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay, certainly, Colm,
There's also a wider lesson which resonates for the debate around human rights, and it's that one of the challenges and one of the lessons learned from the Good Friday Agreement, British-Irish Agreement, was that people have been saying for a long time that aspects of it haven't been implemented or enforced, but there was very little you could actually do about it. Domestic law in a UK British constitutional context really, really matters, given the peculiarities of the British constitutional system. So, one of the challenges with Good Friday Agreement, British-Irish Agreement, was around what do you do if there's a breach in domestic law within a UK context. So I think that has informed the debate around the negotiations with the EU and has informed the discussions around the withdrawal agreement and the protocol and everything else, is that in terms of the rights conversations we have today, it's no good thinking you have paper rights if they're not enforceable. And that applies to the broader human rights conversation. And that's really, really important for a future UK that's out of the European Union, where you lose that European Union background and framework. So the important lesson in all this, first of all, is you need to make sure that the rights that you've signed up to are actually enforceable, you can do something about. And I think Brexit is exposing that, and people are trying to learn the lessons from that. And to just switch into a different conversation, which is slightly separate, is the CTA conversation. It's a similar issue. People, and the Commission's work have pointed this out, people talk about the CTA as if it's a thing, right? Yeah. As if you can hold it up and say, there it is, there's the CTA. And what research has found, and what the Commission have pointed out, is it's built on sand, legally. It needs to be codified and written down. And the reason why people are emphasising a treaty is because we need not just to think what the rights are, but what you do about them. Irish citizens in the North and in Britain need to know that in 20 years' time, without exaggerating this, they're not going to end up in a Windrush type scenario in a British or Northern context. So, and I think your question, is exposing that really
Well,
sharply.
people need to know the source of their human rights. You're all experts in human rights, but when it comes to identifying where are all the rights that, for instance, I enjoy, I know it comes from the Constitution, I know it comes from the EU Charter, I know it comes from the Convention, I know it comes from Irish statutory law, but I suppose an Irish person of Irish citizenship in Northern Ireland after Brexit, the source of their rights, they don't emanate from Europe. They may have rights from their Irish citizenship, but in practical terms, that doesn't give them much, does it, if they're living in Northern Ireland in terms of accessing and remedying interferences in those rights?
One more thing. I think it's important to bear in mind that the rights framework and equality framework in Northern Ireland is complex, right, and is multi-layered, both internationally and domestically. There will still be a range of international human rights obligations that the UK will be bound by in Northern Ireland. It isn't leaving the Council of Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights, still there, the Human Rights Act. I just want to hone in on that very precise point that you've raised, the specific issue about Irish citizens and their rights. And the answer is very straightforward, as Brian has said. The Good Friday Agreement, birthright provisions are not well understood on these islands. And they're not effectively, I think, implemented in domestic law and policy and practice, and that needs to change, and that can be fixed.
But you're referring to this jurisdiction here, are you, Colin, when you're saying that it needs to be...
No, in terms of the Northern Ireland context, in terms of the discussion we're having at the minute about Irish citizen, the birthright provisions, that specific point needs to be addressed and fixed. It's a bigger point, and the point is that the Good Friday Agreement has not been fully and comprehensively implemented in domestic law in the UK. And those birthright provisions haven't been fully and effectively implemented.
And are you saying in particular, do you think that because the Bill of Rights hasn't been implemented, that is the major defect, or is there other statutory failures?
Just let me complicate the answer, right? The Bill of Rights is important for this purpose, and I would say that I was involved, and we were all involved in conversation around the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights remains important for this reason. Serious people around these islands, the Human Rights Commission and beyond the Human Rights Commission, sat down over many years and tried to think through, in concrete legal terms, how you do all these things in a Bill of Rights or a human rights instrument, including the things you're referring to in terms of citizenship and the broader human rights picture. And they tried to think about that in the complexity of the North and in a both-and way, that you respect the identity of British and Irish citizens and you protect the broader human rights framework. That's why the Bill of Rights needs to be dusted off, because people have spent an awful lot of time trying to think through those things.
What happened to us? Did they get bogged down in politics? Or?
Well, the Commission submitted its proposals to the British government in December 2008, so over 10 years ago. It's largely been rejected. It's currently stalled. It's stalled. My personal take on this, right, I can speak. It's stalled along a range of other issues at the moment. It's stalled because the British government is pointing to a lack of political consensus in the North on this, and a range of issues as well. And I just go back to my earlier starting point. It joins a long list of things that are blocked or stalled at the moment, and that's why I started by saying it's a crisis. But look, I know that people who work in human rights and people like me are sometimes accused of coming up with a list of problems, right? Never. One of the things that's remarkable about the work that all these people to my left do, right, is that they've come up with solutions to these problems, but they need to be implemented.
Les wanted to come in. Jim?
I want to just make one quick point. I'll maybe ask my colleague Colin then to pick up on the Bill of Rights. One of the difficulties with settled status, for example, even if you get the response to CAJ is that yes, you can apply, is that settled status carries with it implications that if you leave the UK for a period of, beyond a period of time, you can't automatically return. So there is not a one-bound free solution by, if you like, asserting your settled status. There are some ramifications for doing that. So I don't see that as the answer to Niall's concerns, for example, and the issues raised by CAJ. You'd have to find some other solution. I don't think settled status, given what settled status means for those elsewhere in the EU who apply for it, it has some ramifications if you leave the UK beyond a period of time. And that doesn't seem very attractive to me to say to people who are Irish that the settled status doesn't carry some risks.
What do you say to the argument that people in Northern Ireland will still have the benefit of the European Convention on Human Rights, and in that respect their rights will be protected in the same way as the Charter, even though the Charter provides a little bit more?
My answer to that is a kind of qualified yes, in that, yes, the UK government has said it. At one stage, it talked about possibly leaving the Council of Europe, and I think all of that has been cleared. We have a Human Rights Act, which is the basis on which the Convention has been incorporated into UK domestic law. It's quite clear that the UK government's commitment to the Human Rights Act will be retained right up until leaving the EU. There are no plans to reform or repeal it, but they've made it very clear that once they've left the EU, then they will look again at the issue. So the protections you have within domestic law based on the Convention, and we know because of the history of the island about having to go to Strasbourg in the absence of kind of domestically incorporating the law makes a difference. There are areas of EU law that go beyond the Convention. So the Convention is a very, very important bulwark, but it's not the only bulwark.
Okay. And Emily, is there anything that the state here should be doing to try to protect and vindicate the rights of persons, irrespective of their citizenship, in Northern Ireland?
It's only to echo Colin's points about implementation, the legal underpinnings and the credible legal solutions to implementing the Good Friday Agreement, of which the Bill of Rights, I mean, we've mentioned the Charter of Rights, but really it's enforceability of rights. It's not something that aspirationally is a good thing to do, but something that delivers practical results. And as Les said, while the ECHR generally looks at civil and political rights, the Charter, the reason we focused on the Charter is the broader look at labour rights, social protection. Article 24 looks at children's rights, so it offers a broader protection, which is why we have referenced the Charter.
Do you think after Brexit that a person resident in Northern Ireland who has Irish citizenship could challenge this state on the basis that this state, of which he or she is a citizen, has failed to protect their rights in the European context?
Well, I mean, you've heard the concern from Senator, or the TD for the Short Strand, when he said about the Irish citizenship who's forced into a situation of accepting an identity that they would not choose.
Okay, I think that's it. Thanks very much. It's like everything in Brexit. It is very complicated and unpredictable. People don't know the consequences of it. And just to conclude, Les, I would have thought if Brexit happens that as sure as night follows day, there'll be quick attempts to remove the United Kingdom from the Council of Europe and to shake off the European Convention on Human Rights, because most of the criticism of the institutions made by certain sections of British media anyway was about the European Court of Human Rights, and it's been confused with the Court of Justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan and panel. The next to indicate was Deputy Donegal Leary, followed by Deputy Clare Daly.
Gurmila Magweb, thanks very much for your attendance and for your address and for your answers to the questions. I suppose inevitably there'll be a bit of a crossover, but I'll try my best not to repeat too much. But I suppose just to flag, like, I mean, in so much as, like, I mean, some, I suppose, supporters of Brexit and Brexiteers have tried to argue that the Good Friday Agreement is in no way in conflict with the attempts to leave the European Union. But I think I think the issues that Brexit throws up for the Good Friday Agreement, for citizens' rights in the North, is well identified here, and I suppose obviously a big part of it was that the Good Friday Agreement presupposed, I suppose, Britain and Ireland being in the European Union and all the rights related to that. But just in relation to the citizenship, I think it's important to say that it's not just an abstract thing. This can have real, meaningful consequences for people too. Two examples, and I'll put these forward anonymously, but they're just to give examples of the implications that they have for people. But I came across one individual who an Irish citizen, they're living in the North. Their partner was an American national, and the Irish citizen was seeking a visa for this American national. The British government insisted that this Irish national obtain a British passport in order for his partner to be able to obtain a visa. It was not possible to do that through any Irish legal route. So that's relatively recently, I'm not quite sure where it's at. But there was an obligation on this Irish national to go to the British government in order that his partner could get a visa to travel to the North. So that's one example that I came across. The other related to a non-EU citizen who was resident in the North, whose children were Irish citizens. And again, this person, if they were resident in the 26 counties, would be entitled to naturalisation on the basis of their children. However, being resident in the North, again, had to go via the British system, whereas these were Irish citizens. I suppose their children were Irish citizens in the North. They had to again go through the British system in order to achieve naturalisation. So I suppose I'm putting them forward. If people have comments, they can add to them, but really, I'm putting them on the record as examples of the real, concrete ways that the uncertainty that I believe exists around citizenship can have an impact on people's lives, where it relates to naturalisation, where it relates to visas. And there's probably countless other examples. And obviously that's being discussed in the D'Souza case. I suppose, in terms of questions, I suppose I'd ask all the panellists really, is it fair to say, it's being said that the citizenships aren't properly understood in both here and in Britain? Would it be fair to say that maybe it's a better description that they're not properly defined? And I suppose my question is, at what stage does somebody who identifies as Irish, who wishes to be an Irish citizen, at what stage do they become an Irish citizen? At what stage legally is that recognised to be the case? And is it, you said, Brian, you said generally it is when you seek a passport that's when you are sort of vindicating your rights in Irish citizenship. Are there any other means? Is it if you take a case in a court in the South, is that seen as a vindication of Irish citizenship? Are there any other routes? I suppose is it entirely unclear as to what stage you are recognised as an Irish citizen if you are a resident of the North?
Okay, we'll take that. Brian, please, yes, if you would like to lead off on that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, to be honest, in terms of the detail of that last question, you'd have to ask an expert in Irish nationality law, which I don't know if we've got any on the panel, but I'm certainly not one. Having said that, I think the overall point is that nobody questions your right to carry an Irish passport, even though, as you can tell from my accent, I'm English by birth. All my children carry Irish passports, and that's that. As it happens, that's their choice, not mine. That's perfectly well recognised, and there's no difficulty about that whatsoever. But the point is that that category of Irish citizenship doesn't give you rights in Northern Ireland, except insofar as the UK state says you're also British. And that's the fundamental difficulty that we're pointing to here in terms of the recognition given to the quality of that choice to identify and become and take the option of being an Irish citizen.
Anybody else? Colin Ella, the other Colin. You're welcome, Colin.
I'd just like to say that I think that all this discussion just underscores the need for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. The Human Rights Commission was mandated to advise on a Bill of Rights to augment the European Convention on Human Rights and to reflect the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland. And I think that this citizenship is a prime example of the particular circumstances within Northern Ireland and its circumstances that have become more intensified as a result of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. So I think that a lot of these issues could be resolved if we were to once again look at how your citizenship rights could be reflected in a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, and then how that protection within a Bill of Rights would be reflected in UK and Irish nationality law.
Okay. Yes, please, Colin. Yes.
It goes back to an earlier point. All the examples raised are illustrative, I think, of the fact that the obligations we're talking about raise questions in a British and Irish context in terms of reform. I think in both states there's a need to look at citizenship and nationality law, policy and practice at the moment to ensure that it fully respects and reflects both the letter and spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. I know there's a conversation happening here at the moment around citizenship laws. I think there needs to be a conversation to make sure both in Ireland and in the British context, domestic citizenship and nationality law, policy and practice is reflective of both the letter of the Good Friday Agreement and the spirit of that agreement, because I don't think it is at the moment. I think that conversation needs to be had. More concretely, if I could use today to make a call, I think there is a need for whatever it's called, forum, panel review. There's a need for an urgent review. If that isn't already happening, or if somebody isn't already doing this, to think through in very concrete terms the changes that need to be made in the British and Irish context in order to address some of the problems that we're now seeing in terms of both states. So today I'd like to call for the establishment of a review, a panel, a body, tight time frame, if it's not already happening, to come up with concrete recommendations and proposals as to what needs to change in both contexts in order to fully reflect and address the things that we're now learning and that Brexit really has uncovered and put into stark detail. But many of us knew before Brexit as well that these were issues and problems that needed to be addressed. So.
Thank you for that. Yes, Liz, please.
A very quick comment. The Westminster EU withdrawal bill essentially says that once the UK has left the EU, the supremacy of EU law will no longer apply. So at the moment, and some of the cases you've outlined are cases where you apply both UK domestic law and EU law. And EU law does not always resolve the issues in those circumstances. Once we've left, it'll then be up to the UK to decide which parts of EU law it'll retain. I don't anticipate they'll get rid of EU law substantially overnight, but it gives the UK Parliament the opportunity to do that. But in practical terms, it does mean that, for example, if someone wants their partner or a family member from within the EU, the EU citizens within the UK at the moment have quite significant protections based on what the UK government have said, but those in 5-10 years' time will not have the benefit of EU law to be able to, and the issue of freedom of movement will go. The CTA will obviously deal with some issues in terms of individuals and freedom of movement in the common travel area, but bringing your partners back to Northern Ireland from Portugal, Spain, wherever, those will become real issues, because under this agreement, freedom of movement will no longer apply in terms of coming into the UK in anything like in the long term, in anything like the ways it currently does. And that's one of the clear differences between where we might be in a few years' time, assuming the draft withdrawal agreement goes through, and where we are now. So those kind of issues that you're talking about will probably expand to bringing family members from elsewhere within the EU, for those not who are already in the UK, but for those in the future who may decide, the next generation, for example.
Okay. All right, Deputy.
I suppose, and maybe that brings me on to another question related to the whole citizenship. Like, I mean, is there any sense in which an Irish citizen post-Brexit, in the circumstances of an agreed Brexit on the basis of the withdrawal agreement, like, I mean, will those Irish citizens living in the north, will they be considered in any respects EU citizens and be entitled to rights on the basis of that, or will that be simply not the case, or will that perhaps only apply if they're dealing with a matter in an Irish court or something like that?
Would you like to direct your question?
Just generally, if anyone has any observations.
Anyone like to take it up? Alan, are you showing?
Well, yes, the recitals to the Northern Ireland Protocol is that Irish citizens in Northern Ireland will retain their EU citizenship rights, but the question is, what are those rights? And that's one thing that we've been raising with the task force to identify, really drilling down what are the specific rights that Irish citizens will retain. And we discussed earlier that issue about whether they'll have representation in the European Parliament. So it's a question of drilling down now into a bit more detail as to what those rights of EU citizens in Northern Ireland will have.
Les, did you want to add to that?
It's one of the areas that we've called for some clarity about that, because from the December 2017 agreement, where there was a sense that actually that was going to be a very, very significant set of additional rights, my sense in our discussions is that that ambition is no longer anything like as expansive as originally intended. And therefore, that's part of the reason we've been calling for clarity as to what exactly that means in practice. With the greatest respect, it's important, but access to EU institutions like the European Civil Service and documents for the average citizen is probably not the primary issue for them. It will be about other practical rights. I suspect they will be more about accessing services if you travel to other parts of the EU. If it's about coming back to Northern Ireland and what EU rights will you retain within the UK, then it's much less clear, and much less clear about what the EU are pushing the UK to do. But we have no clarity on that, and it's not for the want of trying. And actually, I know colleagues in NGOs have been pushing on this issue as well, without much success.
Ryan, you might like to add something, please?
Well, yes, just that in the EU-UK joint report on phase 1 of the negotiations, which was December 2017, paragraph 52 of that, just to give the context, talked about the next phase would discuss the arrangements necessary to actually give as many, or they didn't define which, rights of EU citizenships to Irish citizens, including where they reside in Northern Ireland. Now, in our view, the withdrawal agreement, or the draft one that's extant at the minute, doesn't mention those arrangements required, and we honestly feel that was a failure in negotiation by the Commission and perhaps the Irish Government as well. But there is, therefore, at this moment in time, beyond the basics of you can exercise your freedom of movement within the EU, you can have representation by consular, other EU nations, as it were, if you're abroad in a third country somewhere, and you can petition institutions of the European Union. Those are the basic rights laid down in the Treaty for the Operation of the European Union, Maastricht as was. But there are many other rights which accrue from living in a member state of the EU. And it's those rights which, in principle, will be lost by Brexit, and it's those rights that we thought there was a commitment to actually find creative ways of actually honouring.
Can I just, this becomes very important in terms of the current context, I think, in the North at the moment. Many of you are aware there's a major conference happening the weekend in the Waterfront Hall, Ireland's Future, addressing some of these issues. And people read paragraph 52 expansively and thought, I think, that a more expansive vision of EU citizens' rights was coming along. And since then have seen that debate sort of sidelined, diluted, or lacking in clarity. Now, I think that needs, as Les and others have said, that needs to be urgently clarified too in the context of the politics of Northern Ireland, if you want to put it like that, where people had an expectation from the joint report and there's been a lack of follow-through or clarity. Now, if that's an issue of sequencing, if that's an issue of staging of all this, that maybe that comes in the next stage in the discussion of the future relationship or the common travel area, then people need to know that. But, you know, people read the joint report, paragraph 52, to mean more than they would have the same EU rights as an Irish citizen in New York or whatever, that it would mean something more than that. And I think there's been a large measure of disappointment that that hasn't been followed through. Maybe there's work being done on that. Maybe there are arrangements being discussed. If there are, we need to know more about that. We need clarity. Maybe that's going to come in the next phase. But that really is taking on urgency now at the moment, I think.
Are we okay?
One final question there.
Final question?
Yeah, and just literally just a very brief yes or no if you like, and you can answer it if you wish. But would the panel members agree that there's a deficit of language rights in the North currently?
Would you like to direct that?
If all the panelists could address it briefly.
Anybody like to take the first shot at that, please?
Can I just, I'll maybe be short. I say yes, and I want to contextualise it back to the opening statement. And I know I'm single transferable speech here today, so I apologise, but I want to put the language rights issue in the context of the starting point. It's part of a long list of issues that are blocked at the moment in relation to the North. And what's remarkable, I think, thinking about the power-sharing institutions, if you like, that, you know, that a mechanism that was set up in some senses to protect rights in the context of the power-sharing arrangements, like the petition of concern, now looks as if it's standing in the way of progress on a range of issues. But just to end this slightly up, because that sounds awfully despairing, right? That there's the interesting evidential point to make is that across a range of human rights and equality issues now, in Northern Ireland, it's not unlike the position in Dublin or London or Manchester or Glasgow or Cardiff. The evidence clearly shows that there is an emerging progressive majority in the Northern Ireland context for change. So just to end a slightly optimistic note, the key question at the moment is how you harness that to move forward on language rights and a range of other issues that have been mentioned already.
Thank you. I'm going to give you an unusually succinct Northern Irish answer to this. Yes, the Commission's work mandate is framed on international standards of human rights. The Committee on the Framework Convention for National Minorities, ISESCR, the committee have both made it clear that there should be statutory protection for language rights. And on that basis, our Commission has recommended that those recommendations be enacted.
Ryan, please.
Yeah. Well, yes, the first answer is, of course, yes. But just to expand it, St Andrews, the UK government pledged to legislate for a single, for an Irish Language Act. Subsequently, it passed that over to Stormont, where it's been blocked. Now, you know, we accept completely the need in the agreement for mechanisms that ensure that one community does not oppress another in the legislature. That's why there are the particular arrangements for coalition and for consent in voting, the petition of concern and so on. Our concern, and we'll mention it in the paper, is that mechanisms which are there to prevent the oppression of minorities are actually being used to prevent measures that would actually increase the rights of minorities. And, you know, we need, in our view, a human rights and equality-based return to devolved administration in the north. It's got to be on the basis of the implementation of some of the weaknesses that we've all been talking about all morning, the full implementation of the promises of the agreement, the proper operation of the mechanisms that were set up, because, for example, when a petition of concern is triggered, it was supposed to go to a special committee on human rights and equality and to decide, was it in line with that? That's not happened. So we need, and we list in the briefing paper a whole range of issues. Perhaps not every single one needs to be implemented, but it is that the underpinning of devolved government must be put on a secure basis of human rights and equality. The language issue is just one of those. It is particularly important, obviously, in symbolic terms and in other terms to people. But it's this reasserting the fairness of institutions across this island, which has been the main message that I've been trying to get across this morning. We need it to prevent instability, to prevent political turmoil turning into something much darker and much worse.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. All okay? Thank you, Deputy O'Leary, and we move on now to Deputy Clare Daly, please.
I'm not really going to ask you any questions, not because I haven't got any, but because I've got too many. And really, in a normal meeting, we ask questions to get answers, and in fairness, nobody has any answers, really, at this juncture. But what you have done, and I think it's incredibly important, because I agree with Jim that notwithstanding the efforts and the points that you've made about putting the human rights issues centre stage to this, or advancing them in the withdrawal agreement, in actual fact, as far as I'm concerned, and certainly in the public domain, or for those of us maybe one step removed, they haven't been part of the narrative at all. And in that sense, I think the Chair's initiative to have this briefing has been critically important, because the information or the complexities that you've put out there, and even by us, you know, allowing you, I suppose, to have the conversation publicly in front of yourselves and in front of us, has been actually shocking and sobering for me in a whole number of different areas. And I suppose you have highlighted scarily, really, the legal deficit regarding citizenship and the exercising of rights, which needs to be addressed. So I suppose my only question is sort of, is there anything you think we can do as legislators here? If there was one thing we could be doing, what would it be? And in terms of, say, the human rights agenda and putting it into the narrative, do you think as the process has gone on, has the situation got better, or has it got worse in terms of getting a solution to some of these things?
Okay, I'll open that to the panel. I will bring you in after again, Senator. Would anybody like to pick up on that? Would you like to? Maybe, Emily, would you like to?
Well, what I would say, I think you're absolutely right in terms of your comment, Deputy Daly, that the narrative has been dominated by trade largely. So it's been very difficult to get. I suppose we're here today to try and assure you, as public representatives, that we've been doing our job behind the scenes and trying to do our bit, if you like. But certainly it would be very helpful in terms of the public narrative and public debate. I think citizens' rights are beginning to, you can hear the language, even speeches from government, that citizens' rights are being spoken about both by the EU and Irish governments. And I think it's helpful to even pick up the point about the British Nationality Act and the implications of that existed prior to the 1998 agreement. That people, I don't think the public understand that the implications are that people, maybe if this isn't dealt with, that people may find themselves in a situation of being forced to assume an identity that they wouldn't choose. So I don't think that message has certainly got through to the public, and if there's anything that you can do in terms of narrative, and my thanks to the Chair for this initiative in offering us an opportunity, and certainly it's been a masterclass for me to listen to my colleagues from Northern Ireland who have such proximity to the issues, and just to show solidarity for those colleagues who are working in the Northern Ireland jurisdiction as well, I think is important.
Thanks for that, Emily. We'll open it up. Les, would you like to, please?
I think two things, neither of which are things that the Irish Government aren't already doing, but the Irish Government, in its role as co-guarantor of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, clearly has a pivotal role. In fairness, the EU27 have been very strong in terms of recognising the agreement. I think two things from that. One is the Irish Government have made representations and continue to do so on a Bill of Rights, but I think a Bill of Rights is really important. This is a slightly populist point, but I always compare a Bill of Rights to a job description in employment. A Bill of Rights comes into its own, and its value is in times of economic and political instability. It's a little bit like with a job description. If your job is going well, you've got a good relationship with your employer, you're not rushing off to kind of see what your job description says all the time. When things go more difficultly or wrong, you tend to go back and see, well, what are the arrangements? And that's what a Bill of Rights can do. And I think we're entering into, whatever your views of Brexit, we're entering into a period of political and economic instability. So a Bill of Rights and the other parts of the agreement, and continue to push for that, I think is important. The common travel area, again, it's clear the Irish and the UK government are actively involved in discussions around the common travel area and where it will sit once the UK leaves the EU. So it's not that either government's sitting on their hands, but it would do no harm to continue to push, I think, the Irish government towards when and how might we get some bilateral or international treaty arrangements to ensure that when we leave the EU and you haven't got what underpinnings EU law gives you, what you can do to place the common travel area on a formal legal footing with a greater, therefore, clarity in terms of not just what's covered, but what rights there are there which are enforceable. I think those are two things that this committee could continue to push for. I don't think the Irish government will be surprised at either of those. I don't think they'll say, oh, we haven't been working away on those, but I don't think it does any harm to continue to kind of just use your good offices to see where things are moving in those directions.
Thank you. Please, Brian.
Yeah, just on a couple of things. If you look at our paper, there's a few recommendations about the Irish government taking an initiative and legislation and so on. I mean, an example, I think, is the common travel area, which has been mentioned several times. A few days ago, the Taoiseach said that there would be a treaty on the social security aspects of the common travel area, but the rest will be covered by a memorandum of association, of understanding. Sorry. Now, the problem with memoranda of understanding is that they're not, generally speaking, legally enforceable, and it's not clear to us why only certain aspects of the CTA should be made subject to treaty. After all, if I can mention a word that hasn't been mentioned so far, as far as I'm aware, the backstop idea is that it's legally enforceable, and that something that isn't legally enforceable really isn't worth very much when you're in these kind of fraught international negotiations. So I think that's one point. While I've mentioned the backstop, can I also say it's really important that the Irish government stand firm. The question of the border is, of course, and we haven't dealt with it in a great deal today, it's very important for people who live along the border. It's important for the 300,000 people a day who cross the border. But it's also important in terms of its psychological impact, because the freedom to move backwards and forwards across that border today is a measure of how far we've come since the peace agreement of 20 years ago. Any change in that will give people the concern, the worry, the fear that we're going backwards, that what we thought was settled is not settled, that we're going backwards, and that confidence in the agreement is being undermined. So I know there's a lot of pressure coming from many directions and so on, but I think from a northern point of view, the border is not just a practical issue. It's a border of the mind as well as of geography.
Okay. Colm, would you like to?
I think, first of all, the work that you do in holding the Irish government to asking the hard questions, making sure where there are areas that the Irish government could take action to address some of the points that we've raised, why not? You know, if things that can be done, if the legal advice says that can be done, then why are they not being done? And I think, you know, the Irish government needs to follow through on some of this stuff as well, while acknowledging the enormous efforts it's undertaken as part of the negotiations at the moment. Your role in that is important. I think one of the remarkable things about the Brexit process has been the mobilisation around rights and equality issues. And, you know, really it's given life and renewal to the work of the Joint Committee on Human Rights on the island of Ireland. And I think that's been a great outcome, and the Joint Committee's been doing great work, and the Joint Committee work should be encouraged. So where you can support the work of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, think about how it can be developed, its work deepened, you know, invited along to meetings like this on a more regular basis to speak, in a sense, with one or two voices or whatever in relation to some of the human rights issues. Why not integrate the Joint Committee on Human Rights into your work going forward across a range of issues, including some of the justice issues that Les and Emily mentioned already. You know, when you're talking about policing and justice, get the Joint Committee in and others to talk to you about that and the human rights implications and mainstream their work. Look, it isn't all about the north, right? You could say there's a bit of a human rights and equality crisis in this part of the island as well, you know, and that's obviously stark in relation to socio and economic rights. Yeah. There are credible proposals for change in relation to the north. There are credible proposals for change in relation to here as well. And, you know, what we're talking about today is the island of Ireland and improving the human rights of everyone here. There are credible proposals, for example, around constitutional reform to give socio-economic rights a proper place in the Irish Constitution. For too long, socio-economic rights have been treated as second-class rights here, and that needs to change urgently now. So work can be done there. I think you need to acknowledge the situation in Northern Ireland, the north of this island. There are so many lazy narratives currently ongoing about the situation there. I think there needs to be acknowledgement of the human rights and equality crisis that is underpinning some of the problems we face now. There are too many lazy and easy narratives about what's going on. If the Westminster Parliament and government can try, I say try, can try to legislate, you know, to take Northern Ireland out of the European Union against its consent and without political consensus, why can't the Westminster Parliament legislate for some of the human rights and equality issues that we've referred to today across a range of areas: equal marriage, reproductive rights, language rights, the Bill of Rights? The prize of the Westminster Parliament taking that stand is potentially sustainable power-sharing government for a generation in the north, even with the ongoing Brexit paralysis as well. So I think firm action is required. We need to acknowledge the crisis. And the final point, talked about the Joint Committee and integrating them in the work. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do this now, right? This is a terrible thing to do. I am an Irish citizen. There's my passport. So I'm going to join a long queue of people who've done that. So I've got it in my pocket, right? I was born in Derry, and I know, I've said many times before, I've now sold out now, and I live in Belfast, which is the worst thing you can do, right, if you're from Derry. But I'm an Irish citizen. And I suppose the question for me in this conversation is, my Irish identity is about the human rights of everyone on this island, and I've worked very hard for the human rights of everyone on this island throughout my life and career. But specifically as an Irish citizen, I want to know what that document actually means in practice, both in terms of Irish citizenship and in terms of European citizenship. I am Irish and I am European, and I want to know what rights I will have having sold out and now living and working in Belfast in the years ahead, like many people like me, but as in a firm context of the human rights of everyone on this island. So the final point is, you need to, committees like this need to hear more from people like us. There needs to be more northern voices integrated in the work of this place, this committee, as one small step towards realising some of the things we talked about today. So thank you very much.
And on that note, Emily has almost got an honorary chair here at our hearings over the years. So, Les, you may start dusting off one of these cohiers, one of these chairs. Colin, you wanted to come in just a further point. Yeah.
We mentioned earlier the need for imaginative solutions to the problems which Brexit pose. And one area where I think there's been a lack of discussion on those solutions is justice and security cooperation. There are complex legal and technical obstacles to the development of a framework which would allow the UK to continue to participate in the cooperative tools that the EU has developed and which the police north and south of the border rely on each day. But the Joint Committee has commissioned some research into criminal justice cooperation and looking at how we can develop human rights compliant solutions after Brexit, which the police north and south can rely upon. And we'll be happy to share that research with the committee once it's concluded and hopefully present.
Just a small point of information. On behalf of this committee, myself and one of the other senators, we actually sit on the Trans-EU Committee on Scrutiny of Europol. It's part of our work, and it's an area that we take very seriously as well. And there's a huge question as to what will the relationship be in relation to the policing entities within the area of the north of Ireland and Britain post-Brexit. And nobody, and I've asked the question repeatedly at a series of meetings in Europe, and we're getting no answers. They just don't know that either. So, we were with you, Clare. Anything further?
I just want to thank you. I mean, too often these Oireachtas committees are used by members to try and promote themselves for a cheap headline, and I really just want to thank the Chair for coming up with this initiative and for yourselves. It is what a committee meeting should be, a facility to air publicly and tease out some of these very complex issues, and I think you've done it really well, and the floor was dominated by ye, and that's how it should be at these committees as far as I'm concerned. It's been incredibly thought-provoking, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. Deputy Mick Wallace, please.
So thanks, Chair, and I didn't come here to ask questions either. I came to see whether I learned something, and it's been very interesting, and thank you very much. I suppose just on the Emily reminded me when she started, she emphasised that the talks have been very much based around trade and human rights. Takes a very backward place, and it probably reminded me of the time we got over the fence in Shannon to highlight the human rights abuses emanating from us allowing Shannon to be used as a US military base. And the fact that the thinking is that, we can't stop the Americans using that, it could affect foreign direct investment. And we were in Ennis at one stage, and a fellow got on to me in a pub because he was selling sandwiches in the airport and he didn't want me getting over the fence, highlighting the US military use of it, my impact on his sandwich sales. But I just, one question I was going to ask was, Colin at the start talked about the deficits in rights and equality in Northern Ireland and the ongoing crisis around human rights and equality, and the lack of legislative and constitutional underpinning of the Good Friday Agreement. Why do you think, why has there been a lack of appetite to make this happen on the part of the British government, the Irish government, and surely the Northern Ireland Assembly must bear huge responsibility, don't you think?
Okay. Colin, is it to you that question is first posed?
Which Colin has presented?
Well, as he referenced the first contribution, it's to you. Colin, yeah.
I think that, in a sense of repeating myself, to say that there's a long list of issues that are currently stuck. They're stuck for reasons that are familiar. They're blocked in relation to party political consensus, stuck in a number of ways. They were stuck in relation to the Assembly, and now there's no Assembly. The British government is abdicating its responsibility, really, to take forward reform in these areas. And I suppose what I'm saying today is, in the context of where we're having a conversation about it's perfectly willing to take forward these measures in relation to Brexit without the consent or without political consensus, that unlocking some of these human rights reforms through Westminster would be perfectly acceptable. For example, expectations around Irish language legislation. If you look at the Good Friday Agreement section in relation to the Bill of Rights, it's actually quite explicitly clear that was supposed to be done through Westminster legislation. So obviously that's one way forward for Westminster to unblock that. The reasons are well known. Lack of party political consensus. My view is that shouldn't stand in the way of achieving the sorts of human rights and equality reforms that we're talking about now. In relation to the Assembly and in relation to the power sharing institutions, again, to refer to the previous point, the North is falling behind in relation to these islands, but it seems that the politics is behind the people, because all the evidence, I think a number of us seen across a range of these issues, is that there is majority support in Northern Ireland for human rights and equality change across a range of areas. And in relation to the Assembly, if it is back up and running, and if some of these measures need to be taken through there's a very familiar debate ongoing at the moment about the petition of concern and the way that has been used in order to block change and reform. And I think we need to give that serious attention in the time ahead to really unlock the potential that is there in Northern Ireland for change across a range of areas. But I think that in itself now, and we don't have that Assembly there, I increasingly have the view that that is no excuse for the Westminster government, obviously in discussion with the Irish government, simply unlocking these issues through legislative reform at Westminster. Now, in an ideal world, in a number of these situations, it would be wonderful if that was possible in the context of the Northern Ireland Assembly. There ain't the Northern Ireland Assembly at the moment. There ain't an executive. Northern Ireland is falling ever further behind, and the Westminster government and Parliament needs to step up to the plate, to put it crudely, in my view.
Okay. Deputy Wallace, anything further, or will you?
No, I'm fine.
You're okay?
Just thanks for making us think more about these issues in relation to the problems that are going to likely arise. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And Senator Frances Black, please.
Thank you, Caoimhghín. And I don't have, you've covered so much today. I'm actually blown away by all your clear and precise presentations today. And, even though, I've spoken, in the Shannon about Brexit a lot, and I have brought in the human rights issues a lot at the time, but I really, until I heard all of your presentations today, I really realised I haven't a clue, to be honest with you, of the details of it. And I will go away, as I say, I don't have any questions. I will go away and I will study all your presentations. I will be speaking at that conference actually on Saturday about Brexit, but I will take this with me and I will really study it as best as I can. And I want to thank you for the great work that you're doing, and I also want to thank the Caoimhghín today for this great initiative of bringing you all in here today. There's just one small little thing I have to just maybe ask yourself, Colin, with regard to the urgent review that you mentioned on this issue, as to whether you think, are you suggesting that there should be maybe a committee set up here in the Oireachtas, or are you talking about whether we should set up a committee, with the UK, with somebody in the North? I'm just wondering around, and it is a crisis, it's a human rights crisis, there's no doubt about it, it's shocking. But do you think, when you say urgent review, I just wanted, I suppose, you to maybe expand a little bit around that, and what your thinking is around that, or anybody else, or what anybody else thinks around it also.
Okay. All right, Colm, please.
I think it's clear in the emerging discussion that there are a number of very specific issues around citizenship, nationality, and actually immigration law as well, that may or do require change, actually, in the British and an Irish context, in relation to realising both the Good Friday Agreement obligations and also the discussion around the common travel area. We need clarification as to what conversations are happening now, right? So if there are discussions happening now in relation to some of those things, then we need more clarification around that. What's happening? What's been agreed? Is there anything that's been agreed? Now, I think we saw last week there was some reference to cabinet discussion where reference to a treaty that was ready to go and reference to a memorandum of understanding that was ready to go in relation to the CTA provisions. So, you know, if there is work being done, then maybe we need to know more about that. Maybe there's an appropriate time for that to be shared, but I think we need to hear that. But short of that, yes, I think somebody needs to be thinking in very concrete terms, what are the things that need to change in domestic law in both a UK and Irish context in order to remedy some of the things that we're talking about now. If that work hasn't been done, then it needs to be done. And that's where the reference that my colleagues have made to the paragraph 52 special arrangements, because there was a sense in which many of us felt that hard work was ongoing on all this, that this was all being thought through and much of this was being thought about and resolved. If that isn't happening, then that was the context for the call for a review in both British and Irish context to urgently address how this is going to be remedied.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you. Yes, Ruth, please.
I'd also add to that obviously the joint committee has existed, the joint committee between the two commissions, North and South, has existed since 2001 and has kind of carried out that work in a relatively sort of unassuming way until the referendum, which gave us a renewed focus to our work. And certainly it's been very rewarding for both commissions, North and South, that relationship. But the body is already there, and we have said, like, you know, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. So I suppose it's recognising that it is there and it's set out in statute and can be called on.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Okay. Are you okay,
fine,
Senator?
thank you, yeah.
I know that your colleague, Senator O'Donnell, wanted to come back in.
Very briefly, Chair.
It's small little piece.
It's really just to endorse Colin's call for that panel in whatever way that needs to look. And certainly, I think the one thing about today, it's not often, although this is one of the better committees, that you get that kind of uniformity, an agreement around certainly a desire to, first of all, not only appreciate what you have said today, but to build upon it. So I too just want to commend the Chair's initiative in bringing this, because again, it is vitally important that there's as broad a range of voices heard as possible. I think to build on that initiative, Chair, if it's possible, I think there may be merit in exploring with your fellow Chair of the Good Friday Agreement Committee for a joint sitting of both. To maybe build upon some of today's discussion and invite further people in, because this is so cross-cutting, and that might be a space for us to then build on Colin's suggestion. And it's really just to reiterate the message on Saturday's conference. If people haven't, they should get a look at it and register for free online and make their way up the road very easily and without hindrance and take part and listen to what's been said.
Well, I have to say, because I think it is deserved, that you've made an exceptional contribution here this morning yourself, just out of your own personal experience.
I haven't got my passport. I haven't got my passport.
We're not sure what passport you carry.
Since the Tories are so good, would you ever talk to the Shinners in the North and see what they do something up in the Northern Ireland Assembly?
Don't be at it, Mick. Don't be at it. Listen, I just want to thank the colleagues, but I just have a last couple of very quick questions. I'm not going to open them up to everybody, but Emily, if I may, just in relation to the referencing in point number 6 in terms of the you know, the list of key areas, key recommendations. Number 6, in terms of the construct of it, it states the right to participation in public life is another aspect of the North-South equivalence of rights under the 1998 agreement. It is important to consider how those in Northern Ireland to whom EU citizenship is to be offered, and then the word exceptionally appears. I just wanted to tease that a little bit, just to draw that out a little bit after Brexit, will continue to be represented in EU democratic institutions. I think there was, and it's a view I would hold very strongly, it's not only those who would exercise their right to Irish citizenship and consequently their entitlement to EU citizenship thereby, but everybody is entitled whether or not they exercise it or not. I just was wondering in terms of the use of the word exceptionally in that case.
It was EU in the context of non-EU resident, isn't it? It's in the withdrawal agreement.
I think the exceptional it's exceptional for EU citizenship to be offered to individuals who, post-Brexit, wouldn't be resident on EU soil, if you like, or within an EU member state. I think that's considered exceptional to offer that.
It's not just to offer it to those who have exercised their, by choice, their entitlement to Irish citizenship and thereby EU citizenship. No. That's not what you're saying there. It's just a wee bit, it struck me a little odd.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it just is the right to participation in public life. That's not just exercising our right to use our franchise, to exercise our right to vote. You know, the right to participation in public life also includes the role that I and my colleagues play as elected representatives. It has to be taken in its full gamut, I would think. I think it is unfortunate, I would just say on a personal note, it is unfortunate that the loss of the 3 representative seats in terms of the north of the island are not being, I mean, what is the number of it? I looked through all of this earlier. Well, there are 73 representatives from across Britain and the north, and we have 11 here in the Republic. It's increasing by 2. But, you know, I would imagine that the greater number of people here of all political opinion would say, well, perhaps at least those 2 should have been granted to people north of the border to be able to continue that participation, that voice and that linkage. I certainly would hold that view very, very strongly. And I mean, it's apparent that there's already an almost, well, there's an across-the-board acceptance that the 29th of March is, I mean, what happens if there's an extension? Because there is no provision, as we speak, in terms of a European parliamentary election on the 24th of May, north of the border. It's not being provided for at all. And, you know, I just wonder about all of that. The allocation of these additional seats, it's all predetermining that this is done and dusted, whatever will happen. It closes down possibilities, in my opinion, and I'm very, very worried about that. Last couple of things. Yes, Brian had mentioned about traversing the border, the numbers he talked in terms of, what, 300,000 people, but among that number, and I've lived in the shadow of the border all my life, among that number there are tens of thousands who are cross-frontier workers, so described. I wonder, is it possible just to get some little sense? I mean, where I live and people that I know who are cross-frontier workers, travelling south-north entitles you, irrespective of your economic circumstances, to a free access to medical care in this state, a very precious thing. You have a National Health Service north of the border. We have no such thing here. But the fact that these are cross-frontier workers, it's inbuilt into the whole medical card provision that by that very fact, you're entitled to a full medical card in this state. There are tens of thousands of people and their dependents who could very well lose that entitlement, which would be absolutely catastrophic for some, most definitely. Just on cross-frontier workers, is it possible that any of the colleagues, any of the panellists might like to reflect a little bit in relation to all of that, and not just going south-north, but north-south, because it is, as Brian has suggested, a significant part of the daily reality for so many, many people. what are we looking at in relation to their reality post-Brexit? Would anyone like to? Brian, would you like to?
Well, I mean, obviously the details of the entitlements and so on can be quite complex in terms of Social Security and things like that. But I listened actually to a presentation a couple of months ago from one of the advice workers at the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and she was saying that at the moment they only have to ask people who are inquiring about things 2 questions. Where do you live? Where do you work? And they can work out, you know, these are cross-border workers, and they can work out what their entitlements are, who pays their pension, and everything else, simply from those 2 pieces of knowledge. After Brexit, the whole situation will become more complicated, but in ways we don't actually know as yet. Now, the other thing is that mentioned earlier that the common travel area, the Taoiseach said that the social security aspects will be put into treaty. Now, to what extent that will deal with frontier workers as a specific section, one doesn't know. But if I was such a worker, I'd want to know with a certain degree of legal certainty what my entitlements would be. And I'm not sure that a memorandum of understanding would meet that level of legal certainty. I mean, I think the other thing is that the common travel area, of course, refers to the entirety of the UK and Ireland. And I do think that while, you know, that is an extremely important and historic set of freedoms, if you like, and good neighbourly behaviour, there are specific issues around, obviously, the border on the island of Ireland and people who cross it daily for their work, as well as I mentioned earlier, the psychological impact of the border in terms of how far have we come in terms of peace, and are we going backwards. So it seems to me that there's a lot to be talked about in terms of the terms of a treaty between Ireland and the UK in dealing with the common travel area, but there may well need to be specific, well, certainly will need to be specific provisions in terms of cross-border workers as well.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Are we okay? Emily,
just
please.
finally, I just want to make sure that I've been clear in terms of communicating that point you made in relation to
the use of
my comment. Yeah,
yeah.
Just to say that we believe that the continued EU citizenship should be extended to all of the people of Northern Ireland. So just to be clear that that isn't in question in terms of, if I miscommunicated, my apologies, but that's what we meant to say.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for the clarification, because it's just where my head would be in relation to the matter.
Sure.
So, look, we're almost at an end. What I want to do, I know we have our full committee here, but what we don't want is to lose all that you've shared with us in the ether, and that we're the only people going off with this enhanced knowledge and awareness. So what I intend to do, and maybe just at this point we might indicate to each other a comfort factor with our preparing a short report based on all that we have learned here today, which we will present to the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, who is the lead in terms of his role, Simon Covey, that we won't lose the very important information that ye have shared, and that it has further legs, and we will be able to continue with that. So we'll take that decision. Would people be broadly in agreement with that? That's okay. Well, look, I appreciate that very much indeed. And it only remains for me, on behalf of the committee, to again thank Professor Colin Harvey. Thank you very much indeed for your attendance here today. Brian Gormley, to thank you very much indeed, and the Committee on Administration of Justice, to thank you for your contribution and engagement with members. The Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, Les Allenby and Colin Coffey, both of you, thank you very much indeed. And your counterparts out of the border, Emily Logan and Ruth Gallagher, thank you both very much indeed. And long may you continue to work in a joint relationship, and we hope you know, that we will have the opportunity as a committee to welcome you back at some point in the future. So it only remains for me to indicate that the Joint Committee is adjourned until 9 a.m. on next Wednesday, the 6th of February 2019. Goramila Mahagaf. Oh, that's the Joint Committee. We'll be in Select Committee next week. That's why I said it that way. So we're going to